But first, recently released body cam footage shows Tampa police arresting dozens of people in August for alleged voter fraud. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has said these individuals could not legally vote due to their criminal record. But some of those who were arrested claim they were confused by a 2018 Florida statute, which restored the right to vote to some felons. The Tampa Bay Times reports of the 19 people arrested, 12 were registered as Democrats and at least 13 were black. Here's some of the never-before-seen footage of the arrests.
2 felony charges for voter fraud, but they've reduced it to $500 bonds. So it's $1,000 total.
Oh my God, man, what the?
Yes, sir. So unfortunately, right now, we're going to have to take you to jail.
I'm like, voter fraud? I voted, but I ain't commit no fraud.
Well, so that's the thing. I don't know exactly what happened with it, but you do have a warrant.
To help us understand this, let's bring in CBS News election law expert and political contributor David Becker. He's also the executive director of the Center for Election Innovation and Research. David, first of all, what laws are these we saw in the video? What laws are they accused of violating?
So under the Constitution, states have the right to limit the rights of felons to vote. And different states have different rules with regard to that. Some states have very restrictive laws, like Florida has had in the past. Some states actually allow felons to vote from jail, and states like Vermont, for instance. Now, in Florida, there's been recent changes in their laws. They had a ballot initiative and some rule changes that went through litigation that were going to change and allow more former felons as they were re-entering society to have the right to vote and participate in their democracy in Florida. But there's been a lot of confusion about that. The state hasn't been very clear about what those rules are with regard to those former felons. And in many cases, as we saw in this body cam footage, former felons who were, let's be clear, they were otherwise eligible voters. They were adult American citizens. They resided in Florida. They had served their time. They were out of jail. They had been told by employees of the state of Florida that they, in fact, could register to vote at places like the Motor Vehicles Department. And in fact, my understanding is that felons are allowed to vote in Florida. It's just certain classes of felons. So this is a misunderstanding about whether you were or weren't in that class. And it appears from at least the account of those who were arrested, the misunderstanding is both on the part of those who were arrested, but also those who informed them of what the rules of Florida was. So this is sort of a mistake on the details of the law. Is that right? Is that the right way to think about it? That's right. And it's a mistake that appears to be made primarily by the state, who has the responsibility of informing otherwise eligible voters that they don't have the right to vote, particularly as things were changing, as court rulings were coming down. That did not happen here. The state has full control of the corrections department. The state has full control of the statewide voter registration database. And yet these people were confused and led to believe that they could, in fact, register to vote. I think there were two things that really struck me. One was the professionalism and empathy of the officers here, who were put in a very difficult position by the state. They didn't know why these people were being arrested or that it was legitimate, and some of them had to pay thousands of dollars in bond to get out. The other is that we have to remember this occurred within the week right before a major election in Florida, the primary election on August 23rd, I believe it was. And there is really no explanation for the timing here. This took place nearly 2 years after the November election, and yet they waited until the week before a major federal primary to publicly announce these arrests. How should we think about these cases relative to the larger claims of voter fraud, which is itself, in-person voter fraud is quite rare? Is this related at all to other kinds of cases where there have been voter fraud, or is this a peculiarity of this Florida law changing, the exceptions to it, the misinformation and misunderstanding? Yeah, I think it's more of a peculiarity. We haven't seen any evidence that any of these individuals intended to commit the fraud of casting an illegal ballot in the state. It appears all legitimately thought they were entitled to vote, and in some cases were informed that way. And as you point out, we know actual intentional voter fraud is extremely rare. The number of illegal or improper ballots cast is a tiny, tiny percentage. The state of Ohio just announced that they were investigating some cases of voter fraud, and it amounted to a few dozen in a state where millions and millions of votes were cast. And that's really just at the investigation stage. That's not even those that could be prosecuted.
Right. And these small numbers are not only small relative to the total number of voters, but of course not going to throw any election results in a different direction than as they were called. Finally, David, before I let you go, there were also some who were accused or caught, in fact, fraudulently voting in the Villages section of Florida, kind of often a Republican area. And they basically had to do some kind of community service or take a civics class. Does that give us any indication of how, in this other instance that we're talking about now, those who've been arrested, if they were convicted, would be punished? What level of the punishment might be?
Yeah, I mean, we have a lot of questions that come about as a result of these arrests. One is perhaps disparate treatment of different types of voters. I mean, the allegations with other voters, the very small number of voters who might have committed fraud in places like the Villages, where people who might have double voted, that's much more likely an intentional act, double voting, than someone who was out of jail and had been told they were eligible to vote, and it turned out later that they were not, and they were informed incorrectly. Again, also, I really want to stress the timing here. The timing here is very questionable. And I've talked to election officials in the state of Florida, county election officials. They're deeply troubled by what happened here and the timing of it, that it took place as they were already engaged in early voting and mail voting, other things that were happening in the state of Florida. I think a lot of questions are going to have to be answered here. And honestly, I think some of the individuals arrested may have some claims under civil rights laws.
All right, David Becker, a lot more questions, and we'll probably have you back on to talk about them with us. So thanks for being with us, David. We appreciate it.
Thank you, John.